All right, so today we're going to talk about justifying historical truth claims. All this information is from the book by Christopher B. and McCullagh, Justifying Historical Predictions. It's a great book, tons of information. I really recommend anybody that's interested in this topic to look further into that book and to read more information from there because it's a great overview. Despite its age, I think it's a little bit old. I haven't seen any other reviews that are improvements upon it. And I've asked academics in the history departments at state universities. So it's not like it's not out there. It's just that for some reason this still seems to be kind of the one that's used. So let's go through it. So we've got justifying historical truth claims, and we are talking about arguments from the best explanation. All right. So before we jump in, we should go over a key. So there's going to be some figures and some information you can see right here. That's where it'll be. But this is what they kind of stand for. So first you have a present observation. And this is something that can be observed now. So it'd be like a text or a statue or a painting or something of that nature. And that's something that you can see in the present. Usually it's supposed to be or inferred to be have come from the past. Then you have a past event. And this is something that actually happened in the past. So it's different from an observation, different from an artifact that you might see. It's the actual event that happened. Then you have a belief. Now, a belief can be from the past, present, future, or time independent, and it's just a statement that's generally held to be true. For instance, in the past, you might believe that Jesus of Nazareth died by crucifixion. Right, so that's a belief, and you might believe that based on artifacts such as testimonials that were combined into the text that are the gospel records. It could be anything like Caesar crossing the Rubicon. It could be basically anything, and it could be anything from more recent times too. So George Washington becoming the first president. These could be things that are past beliefs. Present beliefs are things that you believe now, and those could be things like, for instance, I could believe that we have a lot of evidence for the historicity of a particular event, or I could believe that the artifacts or that the academic writings on a particular event in the past, such as the death of William II, tend to favor a murder hypothesis rather than an accidental death hypothesis. And that is a belief. That's a belief that I have about the current milieu in terms of academic writings. And then you can have future events. Or future beliefs, and I don't really have anything for future beliefs right now. So just keep that can be there, but I won't give an example for it. And then you have time-independent beliefs. Now, time-independent beliefs are things like the law of non-contradiction, right? Something cannot be and not be in the same time, in the same sense, the same place. And another one would be evidence from early testimony that is reliable is good evidence, right? So kind of these time-independent axiomatic beliefs or things of that nature. And then finally, you have a hypothesis. Now, a hypothesis is just your suggested historical event in this context, right? So it's, I believe that William II died from murder and not by accident, and here is my evidence for it and things of that nature. So that is a hypothesis. All right, so those are our key. It's going to look generally like this, and you can see, obviously, again, down here, you can see what it's going to look like in the future. But yeah, so you're going to have a series of present observations, and you're going to have a series of past events that happened, and usually these past events lead to these present observations in certain ways. And then you've got this dotted box at the bottom, which is just going to be your time-independent beliefs. So this is just going to be kind of the framework that we build from. This is the context that I'm trying to display these ideas in. All right, so the argument to the best explanation has 7 conditions. All right, we're going to go through each of them in turn. All right, and we'll start with the first. The first condition for the argument to the best explanation is that the hypothesis, together with other statements already held to be true, must imply yet other statements describing present observable data or implied present observations. So what does that mean? Well, generally, I guess that would mean something like you have this hypothesis right here, and then you're going to say this hypothesis together with some beliefs. So you have belief right here, and you have a belief right here, and together these, and then also a belief in the present, and together your hypothesis combined with these time-independent beliefs, beliefs from the past and beliefs in the present, imply a set of present observations, right? So if George Washington was the first president, we would expect documentation right now stating that he was. Right, so something of that nature. And you can see the context that I've laid it out in. You've got these arrows that are leading to implication. Basically, that's what those arrows mean. And this is your hypothesis in the center in gray, and your beliefs I've put in green, just as the key that I mentioned before describes. All right, so that's the first one. Your hypothesis, together with a set of beliefs about the present, past, and time independent, should imply present observable data. Okay, so the second condition that's needed for justifying historical truth claims using the argument to the best explanation is that the hypothesis must be of greater explanatory scope than any other incompatible hypothesis about the same past event. So you've got a hypothesis right here, and then you've got an incompatible hypothesis right here. Right, so these two both should not be true at the same time, or it's very unlikely that they're both true at the same time. All right, and to have greater explanatory power means that by proposing this hypothesis, you explain more present observations. So as you can see, this hypothesis goes to explain 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 present observable things, and this goes to imply only 2, 1 and 2. So the hypothesis has greater explanatory scope in this moment. Right, this would be greater explanatory scope. And that's pretty straightforward, so there's nothing really to talk about there. We'll just move on. Condition 3 is historical truth claims that are talking about arguments to the best explanation, is that the hypothesis must be of greater explanatory power. All right, so this is different from explanatory scope, which is the previous one. And this is all about the strength of the implication. So the hypothesis must be a greater explanatory power than any other incompatible hypothesis. This means that it must make the observation statements it implies more probable than any other. So, for instance, this hypothesis implies these two sets of present observations, and you have an incompatible hypothesis that also implies two sets of present observations. So the explanatory scope of both of these are the same. They both seem to imply two present observations. However, this hypothesis implies the present observations over here very strongly. It creates a very strong implication, whereas the incompatible hypothesis only implies it in a somewhat strong way. It somewhat implies that these might actually come about if this incompatible hypothesis is in fact true. So that's kind of how you differentiate explanatory power. All right, so then we've got condition 4. So condition 4 for the argument to the best explanation when you are justifying historical truth claims would be plausibility. So the hypothesis must be more plausible than any other incompatible hypothesis about the same subject. And that is, it must be implied to some degree by a greater variety of beliefs than any other. And it must be implied more strongly than any other as well. All right, so that's the first part. There's a second part to this condition 4 that we'll go over. That's this last part here, but we won't go over that right now. First, let's talk about this one. It must be implied by a greater variety of beliefs than any other, and it has to be implied more strongly than any other. So I've tried to set that up for us. Let's say we've got a hypothesis right here, and we say, what is implying this hypothesis? What about the past that we think we know and about our time-independent beliefs would imply that this hypothesis actually happened? All right, so that's not reaching from our present observable data. That is just reaching from our variety of beliefs that we have. How do our beliefs that we currently have right now, past, present, future, and time independent, imply the hypothesis and the incompatible hypothesis? And what you see is you have, for this particular example, for this hypothesis, you have 2 present beliefs and 3 time-independent beliefs that all imply that this hypothesis could occur. All right, so these directions right here are the directions for the implication. All right, so the hypothesis is implied by 2 present beliefs and 3 time-independent beliefs. Now, in contrast, if you look at the incompatible hypothesis, you're looking at only 1 present belief implying it, and you're only looking at 1 time-independent or time-independent belief, time-independent belief implying it. So what that does is that then shows you that this hypothesis has more plausibility. It's more plausible than the incompatible one. But remember, this is only the first half of condition 4. There's a second half, which we're going to go over right now, which is the opposite of this. It's probable negation. So the negation of the hypothesis, the statement that the hypothesis didn't happen, that has to be implied by fewer beliefs and implied less strongly than any other, by these beliefs than any other alternative hypothesis. So what does that mean? Let's discuss it. I try to create a description of it here. So let's suppose you have a negation of a hypothesis here, right? This hypothesis did not happen. And this hypothesis not happening is implied by this particular belief. You've got a belief about the past that would imply that this particular hypothesis isn't true, right? This would be some like counter evidence of some sort. And then you've got the negation of the incompatible hypothesis. Now, in contrast to the negation of the hypothesis, the negation of the incompatible hypothesis has a lot of beliefs implicating it. So what we would be saying here is that this current belief about the past implies that this incompatible hypothesis is not true, but at the same time, these 3 time-independent beliefs would imply that this negation of the incompatible hypothesis is not true. So it would be arguing that these 3 incompatible or time-independent beliefs would argue that this alternative hypothesis did not happen, or they would at least imply that this alternative hypothesis did not happen. So those are kind of the 2 aspects, 2 sides to the condition 4. The first is that your beliefs more strongly and in a greater variety imply the hypothesis as opposed to the incompatible hypothesis. And then your beliefs about the past, present, future, and time independent imply to a greater variety and more strongly that the negation of your incompatible hypothesis happens versus to the negation of your hypothesis. All right, so that one's a little bit tricky, and it's sometimes tough, I think, to separate this one from condition 3, which is explanatory power. But remember, explanatory power, if we go right back to it, is all about how the hypothesis implies present observable data, right? Whereas the condition 4, the plausibility and implausibility condition, is all about how beliefs imply the hypothesis. And that's a pretty important distinction. All right, so now let's move on. So we're going to be talking about condition 5 in justifying historical truth claims, and we are looking at the argument for the best explanation, particularly condition 5. And before we introduce that, I need to introduce a new concept that wasn't mentioned in the previous concept. So this one is the supposition. So a supposition is an assumption. Now, it's not a belief that you hold or don't hold, but it's an assumption. So we would say, like, if this is assumed, then this would happen. So kind of a contingency type of situation. So that's what a supposition is. Now, condition 5 is about ad hocness. So condition 5 would argue that a hypothesis must be less ad hoc than any other incompatible hypothesis about the same subject. That is, it must include fewer new suppositions about the past, which are not already implied to some extent by existing beliefs. All right, so let's talk about this hypothesis here. This is a hypothesis, and this is our incompatible hypothesis. And what we're saying is that if you look at the suppositions, what do you have to assume or suppose in order to lead to the conclusion that you were thinking, the explanation of your present observable data? Well, in order for this hypothesis to explain this set that I haven't put here of present observable data, I have to assume this. I have to suppose this. Once I suppose this, then this hypothesis makes a lot of sense, and this present observable data becomes plausible or becomes implied. If I look at my incompatible hypothesis, and I'm trying to explain this aspect of present observable data, then in order for this incompatible hypothesis or this hypothesis, it's just incompatible from this one. In order for this hypothesis to imply this present observable data, I need to presuppose two different things. I need to set up two suppositions. Then when I do that, then this is implied. So as you can see, this right here is a greater degree of ad hocness. All right, so it's a greater degree of ad hocness, whereas this is a smaller degree of ad hocness, and the reason, or lesser degree of ad hocness, and the reason why is because you only need one supposition in this case, whereas you need two in this case. All right, so that's ad hocness. All right, now we're going to move on to condition number 6. Condition number 6 is about disconfirmation. All right, and what this is saying is that it must be disconfirmed by fewer accepted beliefs than any other incompatible hypothesis about the same subject. That is, when conjoined with accepted truths, it must imply fewer observation statements and other statements which are believed to be false. All right, so this one also seems to be a little bit tricky if you compare it to the plausibility condition, but it is different. So let's go through this and then we can compare it to the plausibility condition. So this hypothesis is saying that when you conjoin the hypothesis, this hypothesis, for example, with accepted truths. So, for example, maybe we can just call that beliefs, right? So this is a belief right here, and this is a belief. So when we combine the hypothesis with these two beliefs, this is going to imply not only present observable data that isn't around, like it would imply possibly these three things would imply some present observable data. But at the same time, these three things, the hypothesis, the belief, and the this is a time-independent disbelief. So this hypothesis combined with this belief would imply these conditions, which are assumed not to be true in the current world right now. So it would like, say, for instance, it would be like, if we assume this hypothesis and we believe this about the past, then these two things should show up now, but we don't see them. Or these two things should exist, but they don't exist, or the opposite exists. You might argue, like, so if a particular religion was very widespread during this time period, then we would expect a lot of books to be around, but we don't find a lot of books around. So there's a present condition of there being a lot of books, and we don't see that. So that's disconfirmation. And we also might contradict a time-independent belief. So it might be, I actually can't think of an example for this, so maybe this wasn't the best thing to bring up, but there might be examples for it. I can't remember, but at least this example makes a little bit of sense. That's kind of what we're looking at. We want the hypothesis, when it's conjoined with present beliefs, to imply fewer things that we think are false now. All right, so I think I've already provided an example, so I'll move on. Let's go to the incompatible hypothesis. The incompatible hypothesis, when it's combined with this belief, implies a lot more that we think is not true. It implies that something happened in the past that we don't think happened. It implies three things that happened, or three present observable things that we should find that we don't find, or we don't believe are there, or we don't believe are true. And it also implies two things regarding time-independent beliefs that we don't believe. So this incompatible hypothesis, along with our accepted beliefs, implies 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 things that we don't believe are true. It's disconfirmed by 6 things. Whereas our main hypothesis, combined with a belief, implies 1, 2, 3 things that we don't believe are true. 1, 2, and 3. So this hypothesis right here is disconfirmed by 3 pieces of evidence. And this incompatible hypothesis is disconfirmed by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pieces of incompatible hypothesis. So the main hypothesis is disconfirmed by fewer accepted beliefs than the incompatible hypothesis. Not my best explanation for this, but I think the point came across. All right, so that is condition 6. Okay, condition 7. So this is the final condition for justifying historical truth claims for arguments of the best explanation. All right, and condition 7 is just simply that you need to be better in condition 6 than all the other potential alternative hypotheses to such a degree that new evidence would unlikely tip the scales. The hypothesis must exceed other incompatible hypotheses by so much in criteria 2 through 6, which we've already covered, that there is little chance of an incompatible hypothesis soon exceeding it in these criteria after further investigation. So once you have figured out conditions 2 through 6, and you see that your hypothesis is so much greater, so much bigger than the other alternative hypotheses in terms of the evidence for it based on these previous 6 criteria, that's when you find it rational to believe that it is true. All right, that doesn't make it necessarily true, but you can be a rational believer in the hypothesis as a past event. Now, I didn't go over. What I want to do is I want to go over how these compare as an overview, but I also didn't mention before. I told you that when I was looking at disconfirmation, I was going to compare that to implausibility. So I'll do that really quick before we finish. So as you can see right here, this is condition 6, disconfirmation disconfirmed by fewer accepted beliefs. So this seems a little bit similar to condition 4 right here, which is your historical truth claim must be more plausible, but this very specifically might be similar to the second part, which is it is probable negation. So the probable negation of your hypothesis, the hypothesis being wrong, should be implied by fewer accepted beliefs. There's kind of a mirroring effect to this in condition 6, but they aren't the same, right? So this is your beliefs about the world imply that this is not true, right? Whereas this argues your hypothesis and your current beliefs would imply things that you believe are not true. So the first one is things that you believe, implying the opposite of the hypothesis. Whereas this one, condition 6, is the hypothesis implying things that you know are not true. So it's not the same. It's actually you can almost think of condition 4 as in a time fashion coming before condition 6. Condition 4 is about the things that imply the hypothesis. In condition 6, it's about what the hypothesis implies. All right, so that is that. So anyway, so let's look at what we got here. So I gave you constructed examples and very abstract examples of a hypothesis versus an incompatible hypothesis. And what we found, if we go up here, is condition 2, the hypothesis has greater explanatory scope than the incompatible hypothesis, right? This explains 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and this explains only 3. I think I said 2. I should have said 3. There's overlap here, so sorry about that. Then you have the historical truth claim should have greater explanatory power. This is about whether what the hypothesis implies, whether it implies it more strongly or weakly, and hypothesis implies the observable data we have in the present more strongly than the incompatible hypothesis implies present observable data. So hypothesis here has won out over an incompatible hypothesis both times. All right, so then plausibility, we have our hypothesis being more plausible insofar as we have a greater variety of beliefs that imply the hypothesis and imply it to a greater degree. So we have more plausibility to the hypothesis than the incompatible hypothesis. And we have the negation of that, or the opposite of that, which is we have a greater variety of beliefs that more strongly imply the negation of the alternative hypothesis than our set of beliefs would imply the negation of the actual hypothesis, or the main hypothesis. So that's the second version of condition 4. And in this one as well, the hypothesis is coming out stronger. Then we have condition 5, which argues for ad hocness, and we've argued that the incompatible hypothesis is more ad hoc because it requires more suppositions in order to imply the present observable data. Similarly, or on the other hand, the main hypothesis requires fewer suppositions, only 1 in comparison to 2. And then finally, for condition 6, we have that the hypothesis is disconfirmed by fewer accepted truths. So if we presuppose the hypothesis and we have a belief that's connected to it, this will imply only 3 things that we believe are not true. And if we have the incompatible hypothesis and we combine that with a belief, a particular past belief, that will imply 6 things. Sorry about that. 6 things. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 things that we know or that we believe are not true. So the hypothesis is disconfirmed by fewer accepted beliefs. So then we can say, given that our hypothesis has shown itself to be more supported in all 6 conditions by an extreme degree than alternative hypotheses. We only looked at 1, but you can see that you can have a set of alternative hypotheses that you can compare to. Because the hypothesis has done so much better than all the alternative hypotheses to such a degree in all 6 conditions, we can argue that it is rational to believe that it is true. And that is a summary, an overview of the 7 conditions that are required for justifying historical truth claims. Again, I'll say, as I said in the beginning, this material comes from Christopher Behan McCullagh's book, Justifying Historical Predictions. It's a great book. I really recommend anybody that's interested in this topic to read that.